What's up, everybody? Welcome to Mets Off Day Live. I'm your host, Michelle Margaux, and today I'm joined by host of the Mets Pod, Connor Rogers, and SNY contributor Jon Alba. We have a somewhat discouraging show because obviously the Mets are in the midst of a struggle, but we will try our best to keep it as productive as possible. So they're 1-8 in their last 9 games. Yesterday, they were no hit until they were down to their final out in the 9th inning. So throughout different points of this stretch, they've been lost offensively, defensively, they're pitching. Sometimes the effort doesn't seem all there. But we'll just start with the big picture. Connor, what is your concern level with the Mets right now?
I think it has to be high because there's just a point in the year, Michelle, where you look at it and you can't keep saying baseball is such a long season and be careful what sample sizes you pick from. I think the glass half empty approach is this team's problems are pretty evident. The offense is terribly inconsistent, right? There's obviously stretches where they can have these long winning streaks, but then there's stretches where it's borderline uncompetitive that they go through these really rough patches. And then the second layer of it is the starting pitching is, burnt out the bullpen early in the year. And as much as Sean Manaea's back, Kodai Senga's back, you just have to wonder, you don't wonder anymore. It's not sustainable. Guys just have to be better at working longer into games. And that's a really, really scary combination. I love what they did with the bullpen at the deadline. But if you can't get to the bullpen to finish games, none of that will matter. I think the glass half full of it all is we are still waiting for Juan Soto, Pete Alonso, and Francisco Lindor to all be going at the same time. We've had stretches of 2 of the 3 going. We've had a lot of stretches where only one guy is hot. If maybe it's at the right moment that all 3 get hot at the same time, but it's starting to feel like that's more and more wishful thinking as we get deeper into this season.
Yeah, and there's so much to unpack there. But Jon, this is your Mets Off Day Live debut. So
Yes.
Welcome to Mets Off Day Live. What do you think this is? Is this a blip, or do you think this is a sign of something deeper?
Well, there are no 2 other people I'd rather be sharing the screen with than you two, so I appreciate that. Listen, I think Connor nailed it, where at some point the proof is in the pudding, right? And you talk about that top half of the lineup. Francisco Lindor specifically, Brandon Nimmo, and Juan Soto all hitting well below their career OPS numbers. That's not a small sample size. That's something that we've seen all season long. Juan Soto has been hitting sub 160 with runners in scoring position since the middle of July, when he's supposed to be your superstar. He's supposed to be the guy that is supposed to anchor this lineup and put everything beyond him, right? We saw how Aaron Judge benefited from hitting around him last year and vice versa. So far, we're not seeing so much of that wealth distributed across the top half of that Mets lineup, where I mentioned this the other night on Sports Night, but I do believe that a lot of this starts with him, even if Francisco Lindor is your table setter at the top of the lineup. So I do think there is enough of a sample size to be able to say this is much more than a blip altogether. And as Connor alluded to as well, it goes beyond the offense, where the pitching now you have to wonder, do they even have enough gas to get into October? And then once you get to October, how do you go about navigating those waters? Those are real questions that the Mets have to face.
Connor, do you think there's any lineup or roster changes that the Mets might make to spark the club?
We had an interesting question this week on the Mets pod, and we threw it to Gary Cohen because we thought it seemed crazy, and we want Gary is very rational, and he's seen it all with the history of this team. And the question from one of our listeners was, do you consider batting Juan Soto leadoff? And why it seems crazy is, well, Juan Soto traditionally, since he's been a star, hits anywhere from 2 to 4. And obviously he's supposed to be your big run producer. But like Jon said, that hasn't been the case this year. And then you do look at some teams, whether it's the Dodgers with Ohtani, obviously the Phillies have done this with Schwarber, where they like the power bat leading off, especially the power bat that draws a lot of walks. So I wonder if Mendoza, it feels like that would be too much of raising a red flag of desperation to just completely put this thing in a blender. But listen, I'm not going to say time's running out because it is the beginning of August, but the Mets can't keep playing like this, where maybe you try something and maybe it gets not only Soto going, but maybe it also helps a guy like Lindor hitting behind him, where Lindor this year has not been, it's been his worst year as a Met since his first year here as it stands right now, although he's turned it around in August. So I do wonder if they try something in that light. And then the second thing is very obvious, and I can't believe it's taken this long. You got to get Brandon Sproat or Nolan McClain up here and hope one of those guys can just, the bar is so low. The bar is being upgraded over Frankie Montas right now, where I'm sitting there going, give one of the two a look. If the first one fails, give the second one a chance. And with the way things are going for Clay Holmes right now, who finally had a good start recently, but they pull him after 5 innings and 75 pitches, maybe it's time to give both of them a look. And maybe that gives this team the jolt they need, because Sproat and McLean have been lights out in Syracuse for the last 6 weeks. And maybe they give you a fresh arm with some length.
Well, maybe they don't want to mess that up for them. And that's kind of choosing the future over the present right now. But Carlos Mendoza said after the one-hit loss that the coaches are, quote, working really hard. They continue to have those discussions with the players, end quote. But he also implied that it's on the players to execute. And John, you noted on X that this sounded like a pointed message towards the players. From the outside looking in, are you sensing any tension between the coaches and the players?
So it's really interesting because when the Mets brought Carlos Mendoza in, his reputation in baseball was that he's a player-friendly coach, but he's also not afraid to hold people accountable. So in an era of baseball where so many times the manager doesn't publicly hold the players accountable, if you look through the words here, I felt like there was some thinly veiled messaging where he mentioned the coaches are doing their jobs, but the players just aren't making the adjustments. So is there brewing tension? We're not in the clubhouse, so we're not entirely sure of that. But Carlos Mendoza carries himself in a very measured way. I always feel like he's a pretty straight shooter when you listen to what he has to say in his post-game availabilities. But I sensed some degree of frustration with him in hearing those comments. And you obviously hope that the manager doesn't lose the clubhouse, that the coaches don't lose the clubhouse, because when that happens, you have a really hard time getting back on track without major changes. And I don't think the Mets need to resort to that yet. But you have to hope that Mendoza is able to wear that hat of balancing his personal relationships with the roster while also ensuring that the messages that the coaching staff is trying to impart resonate in some tangible way.
Yeah, Connor, when teams do underperform after hot starts, how common is it for them to lose the clubhouse as a manager?
I think Mendoza has shown he can handle this. I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt in this spot, considering what he went through year one. And it's not like he was coming from a small market. He was with the Yankees for a long time. And, I think that he has the respect of the clubhouse from the younger players to the veterans. So I'm not ready to go there. Obviously, you do have to walk this fine line, right? And you do. And Mendoza's been good about this, trusting his players. But if Clay Holmes feels good after 5 innings and 75 pitches, you got to lean on the guy a little more. If Ronnie Mauricio is a bigger threat at the plate right now than Brett Beatty, I'm sorry, this isn't about development right now. This is about winning ball games. And Ronnie Mauricio is a better third baseman defensively as well. There's no need to just throw Brett Beatty in the lineup over and over again in big spots. So I know that sounds harsh, but I don't think this is at risk of losing the clubhouse. I think this is, ironically enough, kind of at risk of losing the fan base. That can be a little overreactionary at times. Listen, I understand it as well. But I think that this rest of this year is not about development. It's about winning games. And at times they need to push guys a little bit more and be willing to hurt some feelings along the way. I think they could even be more stern.
Fans seem to be directing some of that anger at the hitting coaches. And from my standpoint, in my experience, it seems that they're doing everything that they can. But John, do you think that there's more that they could be doing, or is there anything the Mets front office might do if things don't change soon?
Well, a lot of hitting coaches' approaches now are very analytic based, and you're watching the iPad and you're breaking down things meticulously for just the smallest of adjustments that you can make. And that's why I really took a lot of what Carlos Mendoza said to heart, because he made sure to mention that the coaching staff is making adjustments and the players aren't necessarily following those adjustments without saying as much as clearly. And I believe that as you see a lot of this heat start to trickle down from the fan base, people, whether it's right or wrong, are going to point a lot of their ire when the offense struggles on the coaching rather than just the performance. These are major league players who reach the highest level for a reason. They're not there by a fluke. They have their own respective approaches regardless of what player development imparts on them. So I do believe it's a storyline that is worth watching over the next few weeks. I think making a dramatic change late in the season is a risky move. on both sides of the fence from a franchise standpoint and from a player development standpoint within the season. But it is something that is going to dominate the conversation. And I know we're going to further spin this off into some comments from one of our own, John Harper here. But I look at what the Yankees did a couple seasons ago when they brought Sean Casey in late in the season, and it didn't really do anything. So I'm not sure just how tangible of an impact a hitting coach is going to have in the last month and a half of the season if you make a change.
Yeah, well, you alluded to it. John Harper wrote an article for SNY.TV basically saying that they should bring back former Met JD Martinez as a supplemental hitting coach and bring some good vibes to the clubhouse. I personally love the idea. I know you mentioned that Sean Casey didn't work as well. But Connor, do you think this is something the Mets should consider to just bring another voice to the Mets, and the struggling hitters, or do you think that they already have just too many voices coming at them with analytics and the coaches and all that?
Yeah, the latter part of that question, Michelle's a really good point. You do want to be careful, especially with a lot of younger players. The Mets are a weird balance, right? Because how much is a coach going to tell, Juan Soto what to do, right? But then you do have this pool of younger players at the bottom of the lineup that clearly have bought into everything they've said, and at times it's hurt them. Francisco Alvarez in the beginning of the year, and then he went back down to Syracuse and has really turned it around. And the highs and lows of Brett Beatty, the highs and lows, especially the power with Ronnie Mauricio. When Acuna was here, obviously just not consistently hitting. So you do want to be careful. I thought the idea was really interesting. And my take on it is it can't hurt, I don't think. Once again, this goes back to my last answer. It's time to stop worrying about hurting feelings. If you're worried about bringing in a voice like JD Martinez because you're worried about what the guys are in charge of the hitting responsibilities will think of that, well, then at the end of the day, show more results, right? That's how it is. It's a results. The expectations for this team were too high right now to be worrying about feelings in that regard. So I guess I'd be surprised if this is something JD Martinez would be interested in at the moment right now. But at the same time, if he picked up the phone, obviously there was a good dynamic with him in this clubhouse before. I don't think there's any way it can hurt.
A lot of these guys have their own individual hitting guys. Like they work with guys all over the country. They fly guys into their hotels to help them out. Like, I just don't know how much another voice, as much as I love JD Martinez and I know how big of an influence he had on the Mets hitters last year. And I'm sure he could help people individually, but to expect that it would, JD Martinez would magically change everything it's a little unfair, I think, to expect. But
it's more
John,
of a spring training move. That's something you do in spring training for instructionals. Once again, I think Mendoza wants to be careful about showing panic here. I mean, let's not forget what the Mets record is, as bad as things are right now, where you don't want to look overly desperate and you do want to trust your process. So it's a very fine line.
And JD also has a blossoming pickleball career as a professional, may I add. So who's to say?
TikTok career. He's on to bigger and better things, apparently, than helping people hit. John, do you think that Stearns has any regret not making a bigger splash at the deadline? It seemed like a really big splash at the time, but critics say that there could have been more.
Yeah, I think a lot of Mets fans wanted a little more offense at the trade deadline. But the one thing that I'll caution is not a lot of big bats throughout Major League Baseball really ended up moving. Eugenio Suarez was the headliner, and everyone knew he was going to get traded. Ryan McMahon went to the Yankees. But there weren't a lot of high contact guys who can generate a big pop in a lineup that got moved. They went with Cedric Mullins for a little bit of outfield depth, and he can add some speed on the base pass and some good defense as well. But the market just didn't dictate that this year. This was a reliever friendly trade market that you saw all of those moves throughout baseball. I can't remember the last trade deadline we had where this many relievers were on the move. And that's because of, I think, a major shift in the game with how people put focus on the bullpen. You look at last year's World Series with the Dodgers, the bullpen carried 42% of the innings. So there's a big shift in how we look at baseball. And I think that's what ended up shaping how the trade deadline played out. Could the Mets have used another bat? Sure. Were there that many other bats out there that you could have acquired without having to give up a really big return? I'm not really sure there were, Michelle.
Connor, what do you think about that?
Yes, the supply was tough at this deadline, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you weren't going to be able to get starting pitching as we saw. And I think that, You look at this lineup right now, it doesn't matter how they supplemented it with an extra DH if the big three or even big four, if you want to put Nimmo in this conversation, aren't rolling. I mean, so are you going to go give up a top 5 to 8 prospect for a minor upgrade at DH? And then at the end of the day, if those guys are rolling, yes, you love that. But if they aren't, is it that big of a difference? So I didn't have a problem with the deadline at all. I thought this team needed a starting pitcher. I also knew that market, the supply of that market was severely limited, but they needed a center fielder. They got that in Cedric Mullins. At the end of the day, you look at all the money and resources invested into this lineup, it just simply has to produce.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about it earlier, so I want to go back to it. But the back half of the lineup has flash potential, but the Mets struggle when Lindor, Sodto, and Alonso slump, especially all at the same time. So do you, John, have faith in the bottom half of the lineup to win games while the big 3 or 4 are struggling?
No, and it's not even so much an indictment on the Mets' bottom third per se. When in Major League history has a bottom third of a lineup carried a team to the playoffs? It just doesn't happen. You need that lineup balance going from 1 through 9. And the idea is you plug and play guys that can supplement one another when someone is struggling. And if you're relying entirely on the bottom third of your lineup to produce for you, well, what happens when you turn around to the top? When Francisco Lindor is supposed to be the one to establish the tempo for your lineup, as I was talking about before. When Juan Soto is supposed to be the guy who's driving in runs. When Pete Alonso is supposed to be the guy to give you the big pop. If that's not happening, the Mets aren't going to win a lot of games as we're seeing. And not only are you not going to win a lot of games, but you're going to have streaks that completely deflate any progress that you make. And that's why I think the fan base has been hit so hard from it, because there's this Jekyll and Hyde idea where you see the potential. The Mets are way too talented to be struggling in the way in which they have over the last couple of months. And that's where that frustration brews from. So if you're relying on the bottom third of the lineup where you've had to plug and play guys throughout the course of the entire season, as most teams do with their bottom third, you're just not going to win a lot of games.
Why do you think that Lindor, Soto, and Alonso have gone cold together? It's happened a couple times this season. Is it pressing? Are pitchers exploiting specific weaknesses? What is it?
It's a tricky one, Michelle. I think the Mets are even kind of scratching their heads at this one right now. I think we know Lindor is a streaky player. He's the easiest one to figure out, where it's the thing that we haven't really put our finger on yet. It's weird he got off to such a hot start, right? First month of the season at 872 OPS, and then June and July in OPS that was under 630. So that's what's really weird with Lindor. Now, August has been good again, but he is somebody that will be really, really streaky. Pete Alonso, for as good of a season he's had, it's just been a giant roller coaster. First month of the season, OPS over 1,100. Next month, under 700. Next month, back over 900. And then once again, it goes back below 600, and now it's back over 1,100. It's just literally a giant roller coaster, where Soto is the most perplexing one, right? Because all-star caliber players in Alonso and Lindor, their highs are extremely high, but they've been on the roller coaster all year. Soto is the most perplexing one, because you have June where he went nuclear. He almost had a 1,200 OPS. Outside of that, he has not had a month this year where his OPS has been 800 or higher. He's just been a 750-ish kind of OPS guy, and that is not what you expect from a $50 million player. So you kind of wonder if Soto gets hot at the right time down the stretch here, because he's so due for that kind of month. What does this look like? But I'll say this for Soto, and I know he played in New York last year, but it's still different when you're with an entirely new franchise back in the National League. We've seen history show us time and time again, Beltran, Lindor, the list goes on and on. Typically, the first season is the most underwhelming guy for big acquisitions for the Mets, and then they get comfortable. The Mets need Juan Soto to be comfortable and back to himself exactly now at the perfect time, because I think Lindor and Pete are going to be fine down the stretch. They've shown in this moment before that they can play their best baseball, and I think they will find it again.
Totally. I totally agree. All right. Well, we got to talk about the other big storyline here. Pitching hasn't been the dominant force that they were at the beginning of the season. No Mets starter, aside from David Peterson, has completed 6 innings in more than 50 games. So Clay Holmes was the last to do it, other than David Peterson, on June 7th. And since then, starters have compiled a 4.74 ERA while ranking 28th in innings pitched. John, obviously injuries have played a part in that, But are you concerned with the fact that Mets pitchers specifically aren't going deep into games, or do you think this is just the state of baseball right now?
It's an interesting question because on one hand, as I alluded to before with how bullpen heavy baseball has gotten, it is a state of baseball. But you do need those outings where a starter can just level up and take you into the seventh inning or beyond. Like, is it a lost art? Yeah, it is. And things have totally changed in how we approach our handling of starters handing the balls off to the bullpen. However, when your bullpen is bled dry night in and night out because they're coming in the fifth inning, the sixth inning, you need to find some guys who can give you some length as long as it's somewhat quality length as well, where you're not giving up 5-6 earned runs over the course of those 6 innings. It's something that has to change down the stretch here. And once you get to the playoffs, where the type of baseball you play is just totally different and the bullpen becomes even more emphasized in your game plan, we're having a little bit of a different conversation. But right now, in these dog days of summer, as the weather starts to get even hotter and more humid and guys are out there and they're exhausting themselves, you need to find someone who's just going to dig down and give you some length. And hopefully the Mets starters who came back from the injured list can begin to provide some of that levity for them.
Connor, with starters not providing length, is there a creative way to reduce the strain on the bullpen? Because the Mets experimenting with tandem starters, is it just something that Stearns and the revolving bullpen needs to deal with? What do you think?
I mean, you can have a piggyback plan, right? You could listen. If you know you're going to take Clay Holmes out at under 80 pitches, you would prefer typically to have some kind of piggyback plan. And this is where it can kind of transition into, well, say you call up Sproat or Nolan McLean. What do you do with Frankie Montas? Well, that's kind of the role he jumps into, where a starter gets knocked out in the fourth inning and you need some length. Well, that's where Frankie Montas would slot into, because we've seen the Mets do this 100 times this year, whether it's Brandon Waddell, Rico Garcia, Justin Hangeman. Like they've had a carousel of relievers, Chris Davinsky, that have had that kind of role. So if you go into a start or a stretch where, hey, this could be a short day for a guy, we need somebody that can give us innings. And that was something they used to have with Jose Butto, who did not have his best year with the Mets before he was traded at the deadline this year. But I think they need to kind of find that guy again where it's, hey, we only got 4 innings today. Do we have somebody that can give us the 5th, 6th plus, where we then hand it off to our bullpen? And you just got to be more prepared for those scenarios, especially if you do call up one of the young guys as well.
Yeah, so we heard how Connor feels about it. John, do you think that it's time to move on from Frankie Montas? I know that you watched him a little bit as a Yankee as a starter, moving on from him as a starter and bring up Brandon Sproat or Nolan McLean.
Well, I was pretty harsh and clear on this, honestly, when the Mets brought in Montas, and I understood the idea of bringing him in and giving him a shot, trying to unlock something. David Stearns is so good at that. But I felt that he had reached his peak as a major league starter, and I didn't really think he was a major league caliber starter at all. And we're truly starting to see that where, other than a nice fastball, he really hasn't brought much to the table. He's one of the worst in Major League Baseball in terms of barrel percentage and giving up that quality contact. So he's someone who's going to cost you games as the season goes on, just by virtue of that. And, bringing in the young guys to fill in his spot in the rotation is definitely an option. And you like the juice that they could add just from the excitement alone. The one thing I caution with it is, you look at their pitch counts in the minors, these are not guys who are taking on 80, 90 pitches all that often. Sometimes they're being pulled at 75 pitches. Sometimes they're being pulled at a hard 80. And how much length are you going to get from that when all is said and done? And I want to piggyback off of what Connor was saying. Maybe the lost art here and the approach for the Mets is resurrecting the long reliever. That doesn't really exist in baseball anymore with how things have changed, where everything is on an inning by inning, batter by batter basis. But because the Mets do have some young guys who can give them a little bit of length here, maybe instead of forcing them into the rotation, if they could provide several times throughout the week, they could step in a long relief role. Maybe that's a temporary solution for the Mets. Okay,
well, piggybacking on that, Clay Holmes has surpassed his career innings total with 122 and a third innings pitched this season as a 4.50 ERA since July. He's got to be gassed. Like, let's be honest, with the way that he's pitched his whole career, this is not something he's used to. Connor, would you want to see them move Holmes to the bullpen or keep him as a starter? I mean, he was in the closer role for many years, but he also could provide long relief, like Jon said.
Right. I think that will eventually happen. Why I give him at least another start here down the road is, number one, he looked fine in his last start, and they were very careful, which, if the Mets know that, then maybe those days are numbered of him being a starter this year. But you got to solve your most pressing problem first before you move to your second one in the rotation, and that's Frankie Montas. And I know we're just really, really hammering this one, but you can't solve two starting pitching spots in one singular week, right? And for those that counter and say, well, bring up McClain and Sproat, okay, we'd love to see that. But what if one of the two struggles, like most guys making their debut typically do? Then do you just go back to Holmes or Montas? That gets really, really messy. So give Holmes at least another start or two. Get Sproat or McClain up here for the Montas start fairly soon, which should be, I would think next week, although they haven't shown a lot of urgency around this for this weekend, that's for sure. And then eventually you're going to transition Clay Holmes, I think, to the bullpen. And because if you get into a playoff series, right, we know Senga, Minaya, and Peterson are going to be starting. The big question is, what is your plan for a game four? Maybe you go the route that the Dodgers won a World Series on last year, and your game four would be some variety of a bullpen where, hey, can Clay Holmes give us 2 or 3 innings, and then somebody else gives us 2 innings, and then we're in a typical bullpen spot anyway. So not right now, because I don't think you can. But do I think Clay Holmes is making starts in September? No, I don't.
Yeah, that was really well said. Very succinctly, perfectly said, actually. Let's look ahead. So the NL East race still tight, despite their struggles. Mets are still just 2.5 games behind the Phillies. They open a series with the Brewers on Friday before another off day on Monday. Of course, the Brewers are red hot, winning 9 of their last 10. So, Jon, what do you need to see from the Mets in their series against the Brewers?
Everything we've been talking about this entire episode, right? Like, you need the top half of the lineup to get going. You need to get a little length from your starting rotation. That is the game plan to win games throughout the rest of the year. And you're going against arguably the best team in Major League Baseball, who, yeah, maybe you were their kryptonite last year in the playoffs, but you are in a situation where every game is going to start to count, especially as that wild card race tightens a little bit. The NL is so deep, and it puts the Mets in a position where, yeah, you're trailing the Phillies by 2.5 games, but every game is going to count towards the wild card in case one of those 2 or 3 teams behind you in that race start to creep up. So there's never been more pressure on the top half of this Mets lineup to produce now more than it has all season long. And if you can get just enough length out of your rotation to give your bullpen some relief, that's the only way you can try to take it to the Brewers.
Okay, so Connor, this might be it seems like an obvious question, but do you think it's more important for the Mets to win this series in whatever way they can, or is it more important just to see some of their struggling players start to get right, even if that comes at, a cost of still losing?
No, I think it's a really fair question. I think right now it's win any way possible because of how tight things are, not just in the division race where, if the Mets could have tried to salvage the end of the Guardians series, they'd be a game and a half out, which the Mets and Phillies have traded that slot back and forth almost the entire season. So you just got to find ways to win while you're trying to figure it out. And when you win, while some things are really, some aspects of your team are underperforming, it buys you time to figure that out. But I think at the end of the day, it's just, you look at the Reds are now competitive in this National League wild card. You don't want it to get too tight. So just find a way to take 2 of 3. And then I think the pressure kind of alleviates off of everybody if that happens. And then you start to see everybody perform to their standards. So wins typically lead to lack of pressure and everybody getting back to what they are.
That's fair. Okay, well, this has been a very negative episode of Mets Off Day Live. So before we close the show, let's end on a positive note. What is one positive sign of hope, Jon, that Mets fans can hang on to during these scary times of the season?
Look at how roller coaster last season was, and where they really started to pull things together towards the late part of the summer, and they rode that momentum into what is one of the more memorable playoff runs of, I think, a lot of Mets fans' lives. So we know they're capable of doing it. There's a lot of talent from that team that's on this team. They added a superstar in Jon Sodto. They have a manager who's been there before. This ship can turn around, but it needs to happen in the next week or so in order for them to sustainably make some sort of move towards October.
I said this on Baseball Night in New York the other day. I, in 10 years of covering Major League Baseball, have never felt more faith in a team when they're down in late innings. Like, I just feel like they could always turn it around at any point. Like, that's how special this team is last year, this year. Connor, what do you think is your positive sign?
I think I'll close with kind of what I opened with. We have not had a 3 to 4 week stretch this season where Lindor, Alonso, and Soto are all going at the same time. And you would just think eventually at some point this season, even if it's for 14 to 20 days, it just happens where they're all performing at an 800 OPS or higher. And if they do, those are three guys that can carry an entire lineup together. So I think that the fact that that hasn't happened yet, you could sit there and go, well, then it might not because it's been so long. They're just too high caliber of players for it to not happen. Where can they pick up the starting pitching or can they pick up the bottom of the lineup? I think we're going to get that before the season ends between the three.
See, I'm really proud of you guys. Those were two really good positives. And I feel much better after talking about that. Guys, thank you so much. That's going to do it for us here on Mets Off Day Live. Appreciate you guys joining us. Connor Rogers, Jon Alba, always a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.